What if the greatest threat to a 1,000-year empire was a single, blind old woman? What secrets lie behind her milky, unseeing eyes? And why do her immortal jailers, in the dead of night, whisper their fears to her as if she holds the key to their salvation or their doom? The game begins now. Share your predictions in the comments. The air in the Grand Conclave was as cold and still as the grave, perfumed with ancient stone, old blood, and the cloying scent of fear. Torches cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the obsidian walls, their light glinting off the cold, beautiful faces of the Vampire Council. They sat upon a raised dais, a semicircle of perfected predators, and in their center, radiating a fury as palpable as the chill, was Lord Malachi Draven. His voice, when it came, was a low thrum of power that vibrated in the bones of every mortal present, a sound like granite grinding against granite. "Seraphine of the House Corvath," he pronounced, his crimson eyes burning into the frail figure standing alone in the center of the chamber. "You stand accused of weaving lies in the guise of prophecy. You have poisoned the minds of the mortal herd, stirred discontent in their simple hearts, and threatened the delicate balance that has sustained our empire for a millennium. How do you plead?" All eyes, mortal and immortal, turned to the accused. Seraphine was a wisp of a woman, draped in a tattered black robe that had once been fine, perhaps even ceremonial. Her hair was a cloud of untamed white, framing a face so deeply lined it resembled a map of a long, hard life. Her hands, clasped loosely before her, were thin and delicate, but a keen observer might have noted the faint, silvery scars of old burns tracing patterns across her knuckles. Her eyes, the color of tarnished silver, were open and unblinking, seeing nothing of the grand, terrifying spectacle before her. She offered no defense, no plea. She simply stood, a statue of quiet dignity amidst the opulent terror. Her silence was more infuriating than any defiance. From his seat, Brother Aldrich Thorne, the human advisor, watched with a heart heavy with dread. He saw the cold satisfaction on Lady Isolde's perfect, porcelain face, the grim approval in Count Victor's military-straight posture. He saw Baroness Alara's feigned boredom, a mask for a sharp interest, and Duke Theron's avaricious gaze, already calculating the value of the Oracle's confiscated possessions. Lady Cassandra, spymaster, was the only one who seemed to be studying Seraphine not as a criminal, but as a puzzle, her head tilted in quiet contemplation. "The evidence is incontrovertible," Malachi continued, his lip curling. "Your visions have led to human uprisings, disrupted supply chains, and caused the unnecessary culling of valuable stock. Your gift, if it ever was one, has been corrupted. You trade not in truth, but in chaos." He rose from his throne, his black velvet cloak sweeping behind him like a wing of night. "The council has reached its verdict. You are found guilty of high treason against the Eternal Citadel and its ruling body." He paused, letting the sentence hang in the frigid air. "The punishment for such a crime is final death, but we are not without mercy. Your life, a pathetic, flickering mortal thing, is spared. You will be removed from the light you have so recklessly endangered. You will be entombed in the silence of the earth, where your poisonous words will echo only in the confines of your own mind. You are sentenced to perpetual imprisonment in the deepest, darkest cell of the Black Citadel. May the darkness you have courted become your only companion." A collective, shuddering breath was drawn by the mortal servants in the gallery. The Black Citadel's dungeons were a legend of despair, a place from which none returned, their sanity or their lives left to crumble into dust. Two hulking vampire guards in polished ebony armor moved to seize Seraphine. Their gauntlet hands closed around her bony arms with a force that would have bruised a younger person. As they began to drag her away, she finally moved. Her head turned slowly, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, her blind gaze seemed to sweep directly across the faces of the 6 council members on the dais. It was not a look of plea or fear, but of assessment, a sculptor surveying her raw materials. Then she was gone, pulled through the great arched doors and into the gloom of the outer corridors. The descent was a journey into another world, The polished marble of the upper citadel gave way to rough-hewn granite, then damp, weeping stone. The air grew thick with the smell of mildew, stagnant water, and a faint, metallic tang of rust and old suffering. The only sounds were the echoing clang of their footsteps, the jangle of the guard's armor, and the ragged, but steady, sound of Seraphine's breathing. She did not struggle, allowing herself to be half-carried, half-dragged down an endless spiral staircase that corkscrewed into the heart of the mountain. Finally, they reached a level where the torches were few and far between, their light struggling against an almost tangible darkness. A massive, semi-vampiric brute with tattoos coiling up his thick arms stood before a row of iron doors. This was Warden Garth. He looked at the old woman, then at the scroll of condemnation handed to him by the guards, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "So, this is the great oracle who troubled the lords above," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. He unlocked a cell door with a key the size of a man's forearm. The screech of metal on metal was a sound of pure agony. "Not so great now, are we?" He shoved her inside. Seraphine stumbled, but did not fall. She regained her balance with a grace that belied her age and blindness, standing straight in the center of the absolute blackness. The door slammed shut. The bolt shot home with a finality that echoed like a tomb ceiling. The footsteps of the guards and the warden faded away, leaving behind a silence so profound it was a presence in itself. In the utter blackness of her cell, standing on the cold, straw-littered stone, Seraphine Corvath allowed the faint, almost imperceptible smile that had been threatening to break all day to finally touch her lips. It was not a smile of joy, but of commencement. The first move was complete. Her players were in position. Now, she would wait for them to come to her. Silence was not an absence in the dungeons of the Black Citadel. It was a substance. It was a heavy, wet blanket that smothered sound and hope in equal measure. It was the scuttling of unseen things in the walls, the slow, rhythmic drip of water counting out the seconds of an eternity, and the shallow, echoing rasp of one's own breath. For 3 days and 3 nights, Seraphine sat in this silence, a motionless statue in the heart of the mountain. She did not pace. She did not weep. She listened. She learned the rhythms of her prison. She learned the schedule of the guards' patrols by the vibration in the stone beneath her. The heavy, lumbering tread was Garth. The lighter, hesitant steps belonged to the young one, Marcus, whose fear she could smell on the air, a sharp, sour tang. And then there were the footsteps of Leora Stone. They were firm, yet quiet, and they always paused a moment too long outside her cell. On the 3rd night, a new sound joined the symphony of despair. It was not the clang of a food slot or the jangle of keys. It was the whisper of fine velvet on stone, a sound so out of place it was more jarring than a scream. The footsteps were measured, powerful, and utterly silent, a predator's gait. They stopped before her door. There was no command, no greeting, only the soft, definitive turn of a key in the lock that should not have been turned. The door swung open, its groan a protest in the quiet. A figure filled the doorway, blotting out the faint torchlight from the corridor. The scent of night-blooming flowers, cold iron, and old power flooded the small cell. Lord Malachi Draven stepped inside and closed the door behind him, plunging them back into near darkness. He did not need light to see. Neither in her own way did she. "The charade is over, Oracle." His voice was a low thrum, stripped of its public grandeur, leaving only a core of ancient, weary authority. The accusations in the conclave were political theater, a necessary performance for the masses and for the more rigid of my colleagues. Seraphine remained seated on the bare stone floor, her head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. She said nothing. "You have a gift, Seraphine, a true one. I have known this for centuries," Malachi continued, pacing a slow, tight circle around her. "You see the threads of what may be, and I have a need, a private need." He stopped directly in front of her. "Long ago, another seer, one I was foolish enough to trust, spoke a prophecy. He said my reign would end not by the sword of a rival, nor the sun's fire, but by a child of my own blood. The words were laced with a venom that had been steeping for lifetimes. For centuries, I have watched my progeny, my few true-born descendants. I have seen nothing, but the fear is a worm, eating at the foundations of a mountain. Is the threat imminent? Is it one of them? Tell me. For a long moment, Seraphine was so still she seemed not to breathe. Then, a shudder ran through her frail frame. Her hands, resting on her knees, twitched. Her milky eyes rolled back, showing the whites in the gloom. A low, guttural sound emanated from her throat, a sound that did not seem to belong to an old woman. The past is a ghost that clings to your shadow, Lord of Night, she whispered, her voice layered, as if others spoke through her. You seek a future you can control, but the future is a river with many tributaries. I see a crown, the crown of eternal night. Malachi leaned forward, his crimson eyes gleaming. Yes, it shines, but it is flawed. A hairline fracture, and it will be shattered. She gasped, her body tensing. It will be shattered by the hand that wears the traitor's ring. Silence descended once more. Malachi straightened up, his face an unreadable mask of pale marble. The traitor's ring? What is this? Who wears it? Seraphine's body went limp, her head lolling forward as if the vision had drained her completely. Her voice returned to its normal, reedy rasp. The vision shows only the symbol. The ring is not new. It is old. It is worn by one you trust, one who stands close to you. Its bearer has already, in their heart, chosen the path that leads to your ruin. Malachi Draven stood motionless for a full minute, his mind a whirlwind of paranoia and calculation. The traitor's ring, old, worn by a trusted ally, his gaze turned inward, flicking through the faces of his council. Isolde's silver signet ring, a family heirloom. Victor's heavy warrior's seal. Theron's gaudy, gem-encrusted bands. All of them could be the one. Without another word, he turned and swept from the cell. The lock clicked back into place. It sounded a period at the end of a sentence of doom. In the renewed and now profound darkness, Seraphine slowly lifted her head. She brought her hand to her neck, her fingers finding the cool, familiar surface of the old gummus model iron. She traced its intricate, worn patterns. A single, silent tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of effort. The first seed had been planted in fertile soil. Now, she had to wait for it to grow, and for the next desperate soul to arrive, begging for a poison of their own choosing. The silence after Malachi's departure was different. It was no longer empty. It was charged, pregnant with the venom of the spoken word. Seraphine remained on the cold stone, her breathing a slow, deliberate tide. She was an angler in the dark, and the first, greatest fish had nibbled at the bait. Now, she waited for the others to scent the blood in the water. They did not make her wait long. The next night, the scent that preceded the visitor was not of cold power, but of dried parchment, polished ledger stones, and a faint, clinging aroma of rare perfume masking a core of deep-seated anxiety. The lock turned with less authority this time. The door opened to reveal Lady Isolde Nightshade, her platinum hair a shimmering cascade in the torchlight, her ice-blue eyes scanning the cell with unconcealed distaste. The rat in its cage, Isolde murmured, her voice like the chime of a frozen bell. She did not step fully inside, lingering at the threshold as if fearing the squalor might be contagious. Malachi believes his visit was a secret. He is a fool. The air of paranoia he brought back with him is a stench all its own. Seraphine said nothing, her blind gaze fixed on a point just past Isolde's shoulder. I am not here for riddles of lineage or power, Isolde stated, her tone brittle. I am here for certainty. The treasury, it is the lifeblood of this empire. There are fluctuations, unexplained drains. Rival factions whisper. I must know. Is it mere mismanagement, or is it a targeted assault? Will my financial dominion hold? Seraphine's head tilted. She inhaled slowly, as if tasting the fear on the air. The numbers in your books lie, Lady of Coin, she whispered, her voice taking on that same layered, oracular quality. They are phantoms. I see your vaults, not of stone, but of woven silver thread, and coiled within them the serpent. Isolde stiffened, her hands clenching at her sides. A serpent with a heart of silver, Seraphine intoned, her body beginning to tremble slightly. It does not steal your gold. It consumes your legacy. It feeds on the very essence of your power. And soon, very soon, it will not be satisfied with wealth alone. It will turn its fangs on you. The silver heart seeks a new home. Isolde's face, usually a mask of perfect composure, paled further. A serpent with a silver heart. A metaphor? A literal creature of magic? Or a person? Her mind raced through a list of rivals, of subordinates with silver-tongued flattery, of those who coveted her position. The warning was vague enough to fit a dozen suspects, yet specific enough to feel chillingly real. She turned and left without another word, her retreat as silent and swift as a shadow, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. 2 nights later, the visitor was Count Victor Ashford. He brought the smell of oiled leather, cold steel, and the open night air with him. He did not hesitate, striding into the cell and looming over Seraphine, his presence a battering ram of martial intent. "I have no patience for games which," he growled, his voice like grinding gravel. "Malachi frets over heirs, Isolde counts her coins. My concerns are simpler. My borders are secure. My legions are loyal. I need to know if they will remain so. Show me the threat to my command." Seraphine endured his presence, a small rock against a tidal wave. After a moment she spoke, her voice flat, devoid of the earlier theatrics, which made her words all the more stark. "You trust the steel in your hand, and the steel in the hearts of those who follow you. This is your error." She lifted a trembling hand, pointing a bony finger into the darkness. "I see a blade, your finest, held by your most loyal, and in the moment of your greatest need, it will not turn against your enemy. It will turn in your grasp." She mimed stabbing, twisting motion. "The betrayal will not come from the front, from a rival, you see. It will come from the hand you have clasped in fellowship." Victor's eyes, dark and fierce, narrowed. He searched her face for a lie, but found only the empty, gray pools of her blindness. A blade turning in his grasp. His lieutenant, his second in command, the one who had stood with him for a century. The seed of doubt, once planted in the fertile soil of a soldier's mind, would grow thorns. He grunted, a sound of acknowledgement and brewing fury, and stormed out, his heavy footfalls echoing like war drums down the corridor. After he left, the exhaustion finally claimed Seraphine. She slumped against the wall, her energy spent. The young guard, Leora, found her like that hours later during her rounds. "You need to eat," Leora said softly, her voice a balm in the oppressive stillness. She slid a wooden bowl of thin gruel and a cup of water through the slot. Seraphine did not move towards the food. Instead, she turned her head slightly in Leora's direction. "Your steps are heavy tonight, child. The weight of this place that settles on the soul." Leora paused, surprised. No one else noticed. "It's loud tonight," she admitted, a strange thing to say of a dungeon. The shouting from the upper levels. It echoes. The sound of gilded cages rattling, Seraphine murmured, almost to herself. Her fingers found the grooved, ancient surface of the silver model iron around her neck. She did not pray to it. She remembered. The memories were her only sustenance, a fire she stoked in the endless dark, feeding the cold, precise engine of her will. The first moves of the endgame were complete. The web was woven. Now, she would wait for the flies to tear themselves apart. A new tension, sharp and metallic, had seeped from the dungeons to infest the upper citadel. It was in the way courtiers avoided each other's eyes, in the hushed conversations that died at the approach of a council member, in the way the very air in the grand corridors seemed to crackle with unspoken accusations. It began in the council chamber itself, under the cold gaze of obsidian gargoyles. Lord Malachi, his paranoia now a visible aura around him, presided over a meeting concerning grain tithes from the northern provinces. His gaze, however, was not on the scrolls and maps, but on the hands of his companions. It lingered on the heavy, onyx signet ring on Victor's finger, the delicate silver filigree band Isolde twisted absently, the multitude of gem-studded rings that glittered on Theron's fingers as he gestured expansively about trade tariffs. "The numbers from the north are inconsistent, Theron," Malachi said, his voice dangerously quiet, cutting off the Duke's monologue. "There are discrepancies, unexplained shortages." Theron blinked, his pompous demeanor faltering for a second. "My lord, the winter was harsh. Transport losses." "Losses?" Malachi interrupted, his crimson eyes fixed on a particularly large ruby ring on Theron's right hand. "A new ring, or gains? I have been considering the nature of loyalty. It is a ring, is it not? A circle unbroken. But ring can also be a seal, a signature, a symbol of a pact made in the shadows." The chamber fell silent. Isolde watched, her own heart a frantic drum against her ribs. A serpent with a heart of silver. Was Theron her serpent? His greed was legendary. Was he siphoning from the treasury, weakening her position? "Are you accusing me of something, Malachi?" Theron's face flushed with a rare, genuine anger. "I am merely observing the jewelry," Malachi replied, his tone glacial. "Some rings are worn for show. Others are worn as promises. The question is, what promise does that one hold?" He pointed a long, pale finger at the ruby ring. It was not an outright accusation, but it was a wound, publicly inflicted. The first crack in the facade of unity. The next fracture came from the barracks. Count Victor, who had once trusted his second-in-command, Captain Lysander, with his undead life, now saw every report, every suggestion, through the lens of the Oracle's words. A blade that will turn in your grasp. During a strategic briefing on border patrols, Lysander suggested a redeployment of forces from the eastern pass to the Riverlands. A sound, tactical decision. A curious suggestion, Victor mused, his voice a low growl. To weaken the pass. It would leave a flank exposed. To whose benefit, I wonder? Lysander, a vampire of old and honorable lineage, was stunned. "My lord, the Riverlands are where the recent..." "I am aware of the recent skirmishes," Victor snapped, slamming a gauntlet fist on the table. "I am also aware of who stands to gain from a rearranged board. You are relieved of your command, Lysander. Report to the Citadel Guard for reassignment." The order was so sudden, so unjust, that it sucked the air from the room. The betrayal in Lysander's eyes was real, but Victor saw only the confirmation of a prophecy. The blade was already turning. The first blood, however, was drawn by Baroness Alara Crimson. Seraphine's warning of a spider weaving a web in the shadows had festered in her mind, transforming her natural cunning into pure, undiluted paranoia. The spider could only be Lady Cassandra Voss, the spymaster, whose very profession was weaving webs. Inviting Cassandra to a private supper in her opulent chambers, a supposed peace offering after the tense council meetings, Alara played the gracious hostess. The wine was a rare vintage from the sunken vineyards, the glasses were crystal, and the poison was undetectable. "It is a shame we are so often at odds, my dear," Alara said, smiling as she raised her glass. "We are the two pillars of the Citadel's subtle arts, are we not? You in the shadows, I in the light of diplomacy." Cassandra, her expression as unreadable as ever, lifted her own glass. "There are no pillars, Alara, only a web, and we are all merely flies." She took a sip. The effect was not immediate. It was a slow, chilling cold that spread from the stomach, a paralysis that crept into the limbs. Cassandra's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Her wide, morose eyes locked onto Alara's. "You," she whispered, her voice a ragged breath. "The spider is caught in its own web," Alara replied, her smile never wavering. Cassandra did not die. Her constitution, fortified by her lineage and will, fought the toxin into a stalemate, leaving her paralyzed and mute, a prisoner in her own body. But the attempt was all that mattered. When the news reached the council, the fragile truce shattered completely. Malachi saw it as proof of the traitor in their midst. Victor saw it as the opening move of a covert war. Isolde saw it as the serpent striking. Theron, still seething from his public humiliation, saw an opportunity for chaos. That night, as Seraphine listened from the depths, the sounds that echoed down the stone throat of the Citadel were no longer just shouts. They were the distinct, terrible sounds of steel meeting steel, of snarls of rage, and the wet, final thud of bodies hitting stone. She sat in her darkness, a faint, cold smile gracing her lips. The poisoned seeds, carefully planted, were now blooming into a garden of glorious, bloody ruin. The flies had begun to tear themselves apart. The silence in the dungeon was no longer a blanket, but a held breath, a tense pause between the act of wounding and the final, mortal scream. The distant clashes from above had become a constant, grim symphony. The percussion of running feet, the metallic shrieks of drawn steel, the occasional, truncated cry that spoke of a swift and final end. The Citadel was bleeding, and the infection was spreading. Leora came to her cell, her face pale, the usual gentle concern in her green eyes replaced by a stark fear. "They've gone mad," she whispered through the food slot, her voice trembling. "Count Victor's guards are fighting Lord Malachi's in the Hall of Ancestors. I saw Baroness Alara's personal retinue barricade themselves in the West Wing. It's a war." Seraphine, sitting serenely in the center of her cell, merely nodded slowly. "A house divided cannot stand, child. It can only fall. But they're killing each other." Leora's voice broke. "Why? Over what?" "Over shadows," Seraphine replied, her tone distant. "Over whispers. Over the reflections they see in a poisoned well." She turned her head towards Leora. "The air down here grows thick with it, does it not? The scent of fear has ripened into the stench of rage." Up above, the chaos had crystallized into open warfare. The council chamber, once a place of cold order, was now a battlefield. The trigger was Theron, humiliated, enraged, and feeling the noose of Malachi's suspicion tightening. He had decided on a preemptive strike. He confronted Malachi, not with words, but with a concealed, silver-tipped stiletto. "You would accuse me of treachery?" Theron roared, his face contorted, his usual avarice replaced by a wild desperation. "While you consort with a condemned witch in the dead of night, what promises did you extract, Malachi? What lies did you buy to secure your own throne?" He lunged. The move was swift, born of panic, but Malachi was ancient and powerful. He sidestepped, the silver tip grazing his cloak, sizzling where it touched. A cold fury, colder than any he had ever felt, seized him. This was it. The traitor revealed. "Theron." Malachi's voice was a thunderclap. He drew his own sword, a blade of dark, star-forged iron. It was then that Victor, hearing the commotion and arriving with a squad of his personal guard, saw the scene unfold. He saw Theron armed, attacking the council leader, and he remembered the oracle's words with blinding clarity. "The blade will turn in your grasp." This was the moment. Theron was the blade, and he was turning against them all. He would not let his commander face this betrayal alone. With a battle cry that had once rallied legions, Victor drew his own massive broadsword and charged. But his intervention was not one of aid. In his paranoid certainty, his swing was not aimed at Theron, but at the space between both of them, a sweeping arc meant to disable the traitor, but which forced Malachi to lead back. "Victor, stand down," Malachi bellowed, misreading the move entirely, seeing it as confirmation that his general was in league with the traitor. The scene devolved into a vortex of violence. Theron, fighting for his life, stabbed wildly at Malachi. Victor, trying to subdue Theron while simultaneously blocking what he perceived as Malachi's erratic counters, became a whirlwind of deadly steel. The guards, loyal to their respective masters, clashed at the chamber's entrance, their fight spilling out into the corridor in a storm of snarls and splintering armor. It ended with a grisly finality. Pinned between Malachi's predatory speed and Victor's brute force, Theron made a final, desperate lunge. Malachi evaded with preternatural grace, and as Theron stumbled forward, overextended, Victor's broadsword came down in a mighty, cleaving arc. There was a terrible, wet crunch. Silence. Theron Blackwood, Duke of Trade and Economy, lay in two pieces on the polished obsidian floor, his blood a shocking, dark crimson against the black stone. The ruby ring, catalyst of his downfall, glinted mockingly on his severed finger. Victor and Malachi stood panting, chests heaving, their weapons dripping. They stared at each other over the corpse, not as allies who had vanquished a foe, but as two predators who had just discovered they were the last of their kind in a shrinking cage. The trust that had held the council together for centuries was now as dead as the man at their feet. The news, carried on whispers and the scent of blood, filtered down to the dungeons. Warden Gorth, hearing the details from a breathless guard, turned his uneasy gaze towards Seraphine's cell. The old woman was humming a faint, discordant tune, a folk melody from a land that had been dust for 100 years. He felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not random chaos. This felt orchestrated, and the conductor was sitting in the dark, humming, as her world of jailers collapsed into ruin around her. The bloodletting had begun, and he knew, with a dread certainty, that it was far from over. The Citadel had become a carcass, picked at by rival factions. With Theron dead, the fragile alliances shattered completely. The conflict was no longer a clandestine war of poison and suspicion, but a brutal, territorial struggle for dominance. And through it all, two council members, the masters of secrets, remained locked in their own silent, deadly duel. Lady Cassandra Voss, though paralyzed, was not powerless. Her network of eyes and ears still functioned, reports delivered in hushed tones to her sickbed by her most loyal agents. Her mind, sharp and venomous, worked tirelessly. She knew Alara had tried to kill her. The spider had struck, but a spider can be crushed. Baroness Alara Crimson, believing her rival neutralized, moved to consolidate her power. But a deep, gnawing fear kept her from feeling secure. The Oracle had spoken of a spider, but was Cassandra truly the only one? Were there other webs? She needed an advantage, a final assurance. On the 5th night of the uprising, she descended into the dungeons. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and nightshade, preceded her, a futile attempt to mask the reek of panic. She entered Seraphine's cell without ceremony. The spy master is defeated, Alara declared, her voice tight. But the board is not yet won. Tell me, how do I secure my victory? How do I ensure that I, and I alone, rise from this chaos? Seraphine, who seemed to be expecting her, let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then she spoke, her voice a dry rustle. You see a spider, but you look for only one. You cut a single thread, but the web remains. The true architect of the web watches from a higher branch. She leaned forward, her milky eyes seeming to pierce the darkness. The spy master's most dangerous weapon was never her own hand. It was her shadow, the agent known only as the Weeper. Find the Weeper, and you pluck the spider's fangs forever. He's here, in the Citadel, posing as a humble scribe in the scriptorium. Alara's eyes widened. The Weeper, a name from rumor and fear. A ghost, to be given his identity. It was the key to absolute control. A triumphant, cruel smile touched her lips. Her scribe, she breathed. Of course. She left, her steps quick and eager, already planning the assassination. Not an hour later, the lock turned again. This time, it was one of Cassandra's most trusted agents, a woman with a face like plain stone, sent on her mistress's silent, desperate command. My lady is indisposed, the agent whispered, but she must know. Who is the true enemy? Who moves against her? Seraphine sighed, as if weary of the endless questions. The Baroness believes the thread is neutralized. She is a fool. The serpent with the silver heart coils around her own neck. It is Isolde. The Lady of Coin has always coveted the diplomatic corps, seeing it as a tool for her financial ambitions. It was she who whispered the poison of suspicion into Alara's ear. It is she who now moves to claim both your mistress's network and the Baroness's title. Stop Isolde, and you save your lady. The agent nodded grimly, and melted back into the shadows. The result was a storm of targeted, brutal violence. Alara, armed with Seraphine's intelligence, sent her assassins to the scriptorium. They found an unassuming man annotating a ledger and slit his throat without a word. He was, in fact, just a scribe, a brilliant cryptographer, but no master assassin. The real Weeper watched from a hidden alcove and sent word to his paralyzed mistress. Cassandra, upon hearing this, used the last of her influence to dispatch her own killers. They found a sold nightshade in her treasury, attempting to secure financial records that would implicate Alara. They struck silently, efficiently. The serpent with the silver heart died with a look of profound shock on her perfect features, her life's blood pooling around her ledgers. Alara, hearing of Isolde's death, believed she had triumphed. She walked the corridors with a victor's stride, only to be met in a deserted antechamber by the Weeper himself, who had decided his mistress's assailant could no longer be tolerated. The Baroness of Diplomatic Relations died without a single diplomatic word, a garrote of piano wire silencing her forever. In the span of a single bloody night, 3 members of the Vampire Council had fallen, their war orchestrated by the conflicting prophecies, fed to them in the dark. It was Leora who found the evidence. Bringing Seraphine her morning water, she noticed a faint glint from the old woman's neck. The silver model iron had come loose from her robes. As Seraphine adjusted it, Leora's eyes, sharper than most, caught a hair-thin seam along its edge she had never noticed before. Later, haunted by the carnage above and the serene calm of the prisoner below, she could not shake the image. During her rounds, she mustered her courage. "Your locket," Leora said softly through the slot. "It's beautiful. Is it a holy symbol?" Seraphine was silent for a long moment. "It is a reminder," she said finally. "Of what?" Leora pressed, her heart hammering. "Of sight," Seraphine replied, her voice a whisper. That single, cryptic word confirmed Leora's suspicion. When she next brought food, she moved with exaggerated quiet. Seraphine, thinking herself alone, had taken the model iron in her hands. With a deft, practiced pressure from her thumbnail, Leora heard a faint click. The locket opened, and Seraphine was looking inside, not with the vacant gaze of the blind, but with a sharp, focused intensity. She was studying something within the locket's hidden compartment. A moment later, she snapped it shut, but the truth was seared into Leora's mind. She did not gasp. She did not run. She simply stood in the dark corridor, her blood running cold. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You're not blind. Not completely." From within the cell, there was no denial, only a slow, acknowledging sigh. Then Seraphine's voice, clear and utterly lucid, devoid of its usual frail tremor. "No, child, I am not. I see enough. I see the light under the door. I see the shape of a hand before me. I see the shadows of my jailers." A pause, and I have seen enough to bring this entire empire of night crashing down. The game was no longer just between the Oracle and the Council. Leora was now a player, and she held the most dangerous piece of knowledge of all. The knowledge was a live coal in Leora's mind, searing everything it touched. The frail, victimized Oracle was a fiction. The woman in the cell was a strategist of terrifying clarity and resolve, a sculptor who used lies as her chisel to shape the fate of immortals. Leora's instinct was to run, to report this to Warden Gorath, to anyone who would listen. But who was left to listen? The Citadel was a charnel house. The authorities were the ones killing each other. And a deeper, more terrifying question rooted her to the spot. If Seraphine had engineered all this, what would she do to a lowly guard who threatened to expose her? She found herself standing before the cell once more, not as a keeper, but as a supplicant in a temple of shadows. Why? The word escaped her lips, a desperate, breathless thing. From within the darkness, Seraphine's voice came, calm and measured. Why does the mouse chew the ropes that bind the lion? Not for gratitude, not for power, for freedom, and for the memory of other mice who were devoured. Freedom, you're in a cell. The walls you see are not the only walls that exist, child. The ones Malachi, and his kind built around the world are far more constricting. Their order was a cage of fear. I have simply shaken the bars. Before Leora could respond, another presence approached. It was Brother Aldrich, his face a mask of anguish, his casus cabezi stained with ash, and what looked like blood. He barely glanced at Leora, his haunted eyes fixed on the cell door. "Enough, Seraphine," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "In the name of any god you ever revered, enough. The great hall is a tomb. The courtyards run red. This is not prophecy, this is butchery. Then they have butchered each other with the knives they themselves forged, brother," Seraphine replied, her tone devoid of mercy. "They came to me seeking weapons. I merely showed them the arsenal they already possessed. Their own greed, their fear, their paranoia. You speak in riddles to justify a massacre." Aldrich cried, gripping the bars of the food slot. "I have spent my life as a bridge between our kinds. I have advocated for peace, for understanding. You have destroyed all of it in a week. There can be no peace with a predator that sees you as cattle, Aldrich. Only a temporary satiation." Her voice hardened. "And do not speak to me of your advocacy. I know of your secret letters to Lord Arinder and his Surgeon. You play a dangerous game yourself, holy man. You sought to replace one master with another, a little more to your liking. That is not virtue. That is realpolitik dressed in a monk's robe." Aldrich recoiled as if struck. His secret, his desperate attempt to find a more moderate vampire lord to support, laid bare. How could you know that?" "A blind woman sees many things others overlook," she said, and Leora heard the subtle, knowing irony in her words. "You have a choice now, brother. You can add my accusation to the cacophony of this dying regime, or you can use your knowledge to help shepherd the survivors. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The final act is upon us." Defeated and exposed, Aldrich stumbled away, his faith and his political machinations in ruins. Leora watched him go, then turned back to the cell. "You knew about him, too," she whispered. "You know everything." "I know enough," Seraphine corrected softly. "I know that the strong build cages, and the clever find the keys. And I know that sometimes the key is not a physical thing, but a word whispered in the right ear, at the perfect time." The truth settled over Leora, heavy and absolute. She was not in the presence of a helpless prisoner. She was in the presence of a force of nature. And as the sounds of a final, climactic battle began to echo from above, the roar of Malachi Draven and the answering bellow of Count Victor, she understood that Seraphine had never been the prisoner. They all had. The sounds from above were no longer the scattered clashes of factional warfare. They were a storm concentrated into a single, terrifying point. The thunderous collision of two titans, the roar of Malachi Draven, a sound of rending stone and ancient fury, met the answering bellow of Count Victor, a promise of shattered shields and broken bones. It was the sound of an ending. The door to Seraphine's cell did not open with a stealthy turn of a key this time. It was torn from its hinges in a shriek of tortured iron, landing on the stone floor with a crash that shook the very foundations. Framed in the doorway, illuminated by a single, guttering torch, stood the last two members of the Vampire Council. They were glorious in their ruin. Malachi's fine velvet cloak was in tatters, his armor dented and scored. A deep gash on his cheek wept dark blood that did not clot. Victor fared no better. One of the horns on his ornate helmet was sheared off, his broadsword notched and stained. Their auras of power, once so controlled, now raged around them like uncontrolled fire, pressing against the small space of the cell. Between them stood Mistress Ravenna Dusk, the interrogator. Her smile was a crimson slash in her pale face, and in her hands she held a velvet roll unfurled to display instruments of polished bone and cold-forged iron. "The time for whispers is over, witch," she hissed. Malachi's burning gaze pinned Seraphine, who had not stirred from her seated position. "The charade is over," he snarled, echoing the words he had spoken on his first visit. "You have played your game. You have set us at each other's throats with your poisoned words. Now you will tell us why. You will speak the truth." or Ravenna will peel the lies from your tongue one strip at a time. Victor took a step forward, his presence blocking the doorway. The traitor's ring, he growled. The blade that turns. They were fictions. Stories. Admit it. Seraphine slowly lifted her head. The frail, trembling vessel was gone. In its place was a figure of immense, chilling calm. When she spoke, her voice had lost its reedy weakness. It was clear, sharp, and carried the weight of centuries. "Fictions tailored from the cloth of your own souls," she said, her unseeing eyes seeming to hold them both. "I did not need to give you lies. I only needed to give your own fears a voice. You, Malachi, have always feared a challenge to your power. You, Victor, have always trusted your strength over the loyalty of those you command. I merely reflected you back to yourselves." Ravenna took a step, a slender, hook tool in her hand. "We shall see what reflections we find beneath your skin, seer. You think this is about power? About a throne?" Seraphine's voice cut through the threat, laced with a sudden, venomous contempt. "You are still so blind. You sit in your citadel of night, believing yourselves eternal, and you have forgotten the blood that stains its foundations." She rose to her feet, a slow, deliberate motion that made both ancient vampires tense. "Do you remember the House of Corvath? Not the name, surely. We were just another family of gifted mortals you sought to collar. Seers, your living tools." A flicker of confusion crossed Malachi's face, then dawning horror. "The summer fires," Seraphine continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. 322 years ago, you ordered our home put to the torch when my grandfather refused to divine the location of a rival for you. You wanted to make an example. You caged us inside." Her hand went to the model lion at her throat, her fingers tracing the old, familiar grooves. "This was my mother's. The metal was cold that night. It was the only thing that remained cool while the world turned to fire." She lifted her hands, palms up, displaying the silvery, intricate burned scars that laced her skin. "You took my sight that night. Not completely. Just enough to leave me in a perpetual twilight, a world of shadows and flame. You took my family. You took my name. You left only this vessel of vengeance." The cell was utterly silent, the only sound the ragged breath of the two vampires. The history, so ancient to them, was a living, breathing wound in the woman before them. "Your imprisonment," Malachi breathed, understanding finally dawning. "It was not our victory." "It was my invitation," Seraphine corrected, a grim, terrible smile finally touching her lips. "I needed to be close to the heart of the beast, to whisper into the ears of the organs that kept it alive. You did not capture a helpless oracle. You brought a plague into your house, and you locked the door behind her." She took a step towards them, and for the first time, the two most powerful beings in the Citadel took an involuntary step back. "The game is over," Seraphine said, her voice final. "The prophecies were the moves. Your empire is the board, and checkmate was declared the moment you dragged me down here." The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the air between them. It was not a game of power. It was a reckoning, and as the realization struck them, the rage that had been directed at each other now fused into a single, unified, and utterly futile hatred for the woman who had orchestrated their doom. The silence that followed Seraphine's confession was more violent than any scream. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. Malachi Draven, the architect of an empire, and Victor Ashford, its unbreakable sword, stood frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer, catastrophic scale of their folly. They had not been outmaneuvered in politics or war. They had been meticulously unraveled by a patient, long-buried ghost. Rage, hot and immediate, broke the spell. It was not a strategic, calculated anger. It was the raw, feral response of a cornered beast. With a roar that held centuries of arrogance and the fresh sting of humiliation, Malachi launched himself at Seraphine. He was a blur of tattered velvet and lethal intent. His fingers curled into claws aimed to tear out her throat. But Seraphine was not there. She moved not with vampiric speed, but with something else, profound, intimate knowledge of the space she inhabited. She had spent a lifetime in darkness, her remaining senses sharpened to a preternatural edge. She knew the exact placement of every uneven stone, the feel of every draft. She dropped and rolled, a simple, efficient motion that carried her away from his charge. Malachi's claws scraped against the damp wall, sending sparks flying. "You think your tricks can save you, witch?" Victor bellowed, his broadsword cutting a wide, decapitating arc through the space where she had been standing. The wind of it stirred her white hair. Seraphine did not answer. She was conserving her breath, her energy. She moved again, a shadow among shadows, her hand brushing against the wall to orient herself. She was a player in a game she had designed, and the dungeon was her board. Leora. The name was not a scream, but a command, sharp and clear. The young guard, who had been standing frozen in the corridor, witnessing the impossible, jolted into action. She didn't know why she obeyed. Perhaps it was the sheer authority in that voice, or the sight of the two monsters who had ruled her world with terror, now being led a dance by their blind prisoner. She slammed the heavy iron door that Gorath had left ajar, plunging the cell into near-total blackness. The only light was the faint, hellish glow from Malachi's eyes and the torch sputtering in the corridor outside. The darkness was Seraphine's element. Malachi and Victor snarled, their superior eyesight struggling to adjust to the absolute loss of light. But Seraphine needed no adjustment. She heard the rustle of Malachi's cloak as he turned, the grind of Victor's armored boot on the stone. She could smell their fury, their confusion. A new sound joined the chaos, a soft, slithering whisper that seemed to come from the very stones, a sound of dry scales and forgotten promises. The shadow, the entity that haunted the deepest corridors, drawn to the potent energies of ruin and revenge. It did not show itself, but its presence was a sudden, icy dread that seeped into the room, making even the vampires hesitate. In that moment of supernatural fear, Victor, disoriented and enraged, swung his sword at a sound. The massive blade did not connect with Seraphine. It connected with Malachi, who had been moving towards the same space. The star-forged iron bit deep into Malachi's side. A sound of pure, uncomprehending agony tore from the council leader's throat. It was not the wound, but the source, the final, ultimate betrayal. He turned on Victor, his own claws slashing out in a dying reflex. "You fool!" Malachi gasped, his life's blood, black in the gloom, pouring onto the floor. Victor stared in horror, the hilt of his sword slick in his hands. He saw it then, with terrible clarity, the blade that turns in your grasp. It was not his lieutenant. It was his own. He had, in his paranoid fury, struck the killing blow against his own leader, just as the oracle had foretold. The prophecy, a lie built on his own nature, had come true. You knew," Victor whispered into the darkness, his eyes wide with madness and despair, seeking the unseen Seraphine. From the corner, her voice came, calm and final. "I knew you." With a cry of shattered sanity, Victor tore the sword from Malachi's body and charged the sound of her voice. He did not see the low, protruding stone ledge she had memorized weeks ago. His armored shin connected with the unyielding granite with the sickening crack. He stumbled forward, his head smashing against the wall with the force of his own charge. There was a dull, final crunch, and then silence. The storm was over. The door creaked open, letting in a sliver of torchlight. Leora stood there, her face a mask of terror and awe. In the gloom, she could see the two fallen titans, their dark blood mingling on the floor. And standing between them, unharmed, was Seraphine Corvath, her chest rising and falling steadily, her blind eyes gazing into a distance only she could perceive. The game was over. The king and his knight had fallen. The board was clear. The silence that settled over the Black Citadel was absolute. It was not the quiet of peace, but the void left after a cataclysm. The final, furious clash between Malachi and Victor had been the last gasp of a dying regime. Now there was only the drip of water, the whisper of settling stone, and the slow, cold seep of blood into ancient cracks. Leora did not sheath her sword. The weapon felt alien in her hand, a useless weight against the scale of what had just transpired. She stared at the bodies of the two most powerful beings she had ever known, lying broken at the feet of the frail, blind woman they had imprisoned. The world had been turned inside out. Seraphine stood motionless for a long moment, her head bowed as if in prayer or remembrance. Then she knelt, not in weakness, but with a deliberate, ceremonial grace. Her fingers, delicate and scarred, brushed the cold stone floor, tracing the edges of the dark pool spreading from Malachi's body. She brought her fingertips to her lips, a gesture of ancient, somber finality. "It is done," she whispered to the darkness. The words were not a declaration of victory, but a eulogy. She then turned her head towards the doorway. "Leora, Brother Aldrich, the door is open. You may enter." Aldrich, who had been cowering in the corridor, drawn by the silence, stumbled in. He took in the scene and fell to his knees, retching, his prayers turning to choked sobs. "Gods, what have we done? What have you done?" "What was necessary?" Seraphine replied, rising to her feet. Her voice was tired, hollowed out. The fire of vengeance that had sustained her for centuries was now ash. "I have not created this chaos. I have merely pruned a poisoned tree. The rot was theirs. It had been festering for longer than you have drawn breath." With Leora's hesitant help, Seraphine stepped over the threshold of her cell for the first time in weeks. She did not stumble. She moved with the quiet confidence of one who knows the path, even in absolute darkness. They ascended the spiral staircase, a grim procession, the architect of ruin, the horrified monk, and the guard who had become an unwitting acolyte. The citadel they emerged into was a vision of hell. Bodies of vampire and mortal guards lay where they had fallen, locked in eternal combat. Tapestries were slashed and burned. The air was thick with the coppery stench of blood and the ozone tang of spent magic. A handful of survivors, a few guards, some terrified servants, cowered in corners, their eyes wide with shock. They saw the old woman in the tattered robe, led by Leora, and they did not know whether to see her as a savior or a demon. Seraphine stopped in the grand conclave, the very room where she had been condemned. The obsidian thrones of the council stood empty, gathering dust. The magnificent stained glass window, depicting the founding of the vampire empire, was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures obscuring the faces of the proud, immortal founders. She walked to the great arched window that looked east, towards the lands of the rising sun. Leora guided her to the ledge. "The sun," Seraphine murmured. "I cannot see its light, but I can feel its warmth." She lifted her face, and the first, faint rays of dawn kissed her weathered skin, illuminating the deep lines of her face and the milky, unseeing orbs of her eyes. It was a face that had witnessed the worst of the night and had engineered its end. She was free. The cage was gone. The jailers were dead. But as she stood there, feeling the warmth on her skin, a profound emptiness settled within her. Her life had been a single, unwavering arrow shot towards this one moment. Now that it had found its mark, there was nothing left. No purpose, no future, only the vast, silent aftermath. She had saved the world from tyrants. She had freed the mortal cattle from a predestined slaughter. She had avenged a family forgotten by time. But at what cost? The halls were littered with the dead, pawns in her game. The stability of a continent, however cruel, was shattered. A power vacuum now yawned wide, and nature abhorred a vacuum. What new darkness, what human warlord or forgotten horror, would now rise to fill the void left by the fallen vampires? Leora stood beside her, watching the sun rise over a broken world. She looked at Seraphine's profile, etched with a sorrow too deep for tears, and she understood the final, terrible truth. The game was over. The blind oracle had won. But there are no victors in a game of annihilation. Only survivors, left to wander the ruins. Thank you for watching. First of all, the stories we tell are either entirely fictional or inspired by real events. If you have any stories you'd like to share with us, let's chat in the comment section. If you liked our story, we'd appreciate it if you gave our video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on our next videos. You can check out the playlist created for other stories on our channel in the card section at the top right. See you in the next video.